So I receive royalties for 2 books on critical care published by McGraw-Hill. I need to point that out. Then physicians commonly ask, is some aspect of medicine, be it weaning, non-invasive ventilation or whatever, an art or a science? And this question usually carries pejorative connotations. Science is the acme of a physician's aspirations, whereas clinical activity, and especially art, is judged less cerebral and praiseworthy. And before I address the question, is medicine an art or a science, I need to deal with the meaning of the words involved. Science is too diverse and protean an enterprise to be captured by a concise definition. And no definition has ever commanded widespread assent. It does, however, possess several distinctive characteristics. Science strives to deepen our understanding of the world and its structure. The use of scientific instruments has prodigiously expanded our grasp of physical reality. The goal is to continually expand our ability to glimpse into regions that extend beyond the previously mapped out territory. Explanations are sought in terms of physical forces and events to gain understanding in a mechanistic and causal way. Research is as much a work of the imagination as effort at the laboratory bench. The most important instrument is always the mind of the investigator. As with science, there is no universally accepted definition of medicine. William Osler, who hails from Bond Head at the outskirts of Toronto, and I gather about a 2-hour drive from where you are presently sitting, he articulated the goals of medicine as to prevent disease, to relieve suffering, and to heal the sick. This is our work. Of over 11 million employees involved in American healthcare, constituting 1 in 10 of the entire US workforce, only 1 in 20 is a physician. Facilities and backup services have a place in healthcare, but they are not medicine. Medicine is simply the intimate care that a doctor delivers to a sick person. All else is secondary. The words science and medicine are challenging enough, but things get stickier when we come to art. It is the word art that renders commentators' statements inchoate and fatuous. Meaning becomes muddled by layers of ambiguity and confusion arising in part from mutations in the usage of this word art over centuries. The word dates back to texts gathered within the Hippocratic corpus, such as On the Art. The corpus also contains the most famous aphorism in medicine, Vita brevis, ars longa, usually translated as life is short, art is long. By ars, Hippocratic physicians are referring to the capacity for planned action, the ability to act prudently, as opposed to action on the basis of chance, arbitrary action. Art is also referred to as a skill or a craft, as conveyed in expressions such as the art of war and the art of boiling sugar, which is an essential skill for confectioners. In the 18th century, scholars made a distinction between the practical arts associated with technology and the fine arts dealing with aesthetic activities such as music and literature and painting. In the Anglophone world, art is today used as a synonym for the fine arts. The commingling of art and the fine arts does not happen on the European continent, but it's a taken for granted premise among Anglophone authors, writing on the binary framework of art science. When physicians contemplate the question, is medicine an art or a science, in such an aesthetic sense, their thinking can only be muddled and fatuous. So commentators on the subject have strayed very far from the Hippocratic meaning of Ars. The most insightful comments on the binary framework of art science were made by the Nobel laureate Peter Medawar, founding father of transplantation immunology. In commencement addresses, clinicians who discourse upon the spirit of medicine will always point out that while there is a large and profoundly important scientific element in the practice of medicine, there is also an indefinable artist, an imaginative insight. And medicine, they will tell us, is born of a marriage between the two. But then the speaker spoils everything by getting the bride and the groom confused. Medawar is emphasizing that the key element in scientific advance is the imaginative, intuitive element, the so-called female component. Medawar regarded the creative, intuitive element as more important than the use of equipment, ritual fact-finding, and induction, the so-called male component. It is the imaginative bride, not the groom, that drives progress in science. The key thought here is that transformative research depends on great leaps of imagination. The bride, not incremental change. Clinical practice needs to be constantly advancing, otherwise it becomes regressive. Only through transformative research can clinical practice surmount the challenges as they arise. The science of cardiology was transformed by the balloon angioplastic catheter, which was invented by 32-year-old Andreas Grunzig on his kitchen table in the evenings following full-time clinical activity and with no research funding. The science of sleep apnea was transformed by a study on CPAP conducted by 36-year-old Colin Sullivan in 5 patients. Here are tracings from Sullivan's first CPAP experiment. So initially up there with the orange arrow, you see obstructive apneas occurring repetitively. Then at A, with the next orange arrow, the CPAP is gradually increased and the apneas disappear. And then at B, with the next orange arrow, the CPAP is removed and the apneas reappear. Transformative discoveries stimulate large bodies of research by other investigators who subsequently map out the ultimate ramifications of a new discovery. Today, many young physicians misunderstand what constitutes transformative medical science. We are constantly instructed to look on randomized controlled trials as the pinnacle of research. RCTs are accorded laudatory terms such as level 1 and gold standard. But RCTs are hardly ever about new ideas, merely the application of ideas that were put forward by some basic researcher. A defining characteristics of RCTs is their Me Too flavor. Planning an RCT obtaining funding for it, enrolling patients, and reporting results has become a formulaic logistical exercise. It requires management skills, as exemplified by contract research organizations, which are typically hired by pharmaceutical companies to conduct trials. It would be better to classify RCTs not as science, but as health technology assessment. And in fact, this was the term that used to be used in the past. RCTs simply do not contain the imaginative creative component that characterizes transformative science. This is not to demean RCTs. They are very helpful in guiding clinical practice, and I have published RCTs in the New England and in JAMA. I've also published papers containing descriptive demographics and audit analysis, which do not possess the imaginative creativity of transformative science. The difference between RCTs and transformative science parallels the difference between prose and poetry. Transformative science depends on researchers with their heads in the clouds, dreamers, who are conjuring up new mechanisms and entities that nobody has previously conceptualized. As contrasted with practical, prosaic journeymen who have their feet implanted securely on terra firma. To illustrate the contrast between transformative science and RCTs, I turn to Warren and Marshall's discovery on the role of Helicobacter in causing peptic ulcer disease. Barry Marshall is the only practicing clinician to receive a Nobel Prize in the past 50 years. In July 1981, the 29-year-old internal medicine resident began a GI rotation in Perth, Western Australia. Neither Marshall nor his supervisor, Robin Warren, a clinical pathologist, had any research funding. Medical dogma of the day decreed the stomach was sterile and bacteria could not survive in gastric acid. But Warren had repeatedly seen bacteria in the stomach. I prefer to believe my eyes, not the medical textbooks or the medical fraternity. Marshall prospectively obtained biopsy specimens in patients undergoing upper GI endoscopy. Warren read the histology blinded to clinical details. Although bacteria could be seen on the gram stain, 34 attempts to culture bacteria were unsuccessful. On Holy Thursday, the 35th biopsy was placed in the culture cabinet. Technicians typically inspected the plates after 2 days. Because of the 5-day holiday, the plates were not inspected until Tuesday, and tiny colonies were visible. So serendipity. Yes, the Easter holiday was good luck, but mucking around in a lab puts you in the path of luck. Real life science offers you opportunities not foreseen in the constrained protocol of a research grant. In July 1982, Marshall rotated at Port Hedland Hospital, a remote location more than 1,000 miles north of Perth. Instead of complaining of being detached from the center of activity, Marshall reflected, it was an important period. I had time to do extensive literature search, time to digest our results and write it up. In January 1983, Marshall submitted preliminary findings as a letter to the editor, which would be below level 5 on the EBM grading scale. In February 1983, Marshall submitted an abstract to the Gastroenterological Society of Australia, which was meeting in Perth, and so it would not involve any travel costs. The abstract was rejected. The secretary wrote, of the 67 abstracts submitted, we could only accept 56. Marshall and Warren's findings flew in the face of accepted dogma. It was undercutting the basis of gastroenterology, which had experienced a funding boom with the advent of H2 receptor blockers, the world's most widely used drugs at that time. Marshall recalls, I used to get into pretty hostile arguments. At one conference, I was just about leaping off the stage, throttling people who were making very inane comments. He recognized he needed more convincing causal evidence to convince the critics. 1984 was the centenary of Koch's postulates. Koch's third postulate states, the organism isolated in pure culture must initiate and reproduce the disease when re-inoculated into susceptible animals. In January, Marshall tried to infect pigs with the organism, but the experiments failed. In June, he underwent endoscopy. His gastric mucosa was normal. On June the 12th, he swallowed 30 cc's of pure H. pylori culture. 10 days later, endoscopy revealed active gastritis and many H. pylori organisms, satisfying Koch's third postulate. Marshall reported the results in the Medical Journal of Australia, which is a low impact factor journal. In 2005, Marshall and Warren were awarded the Nobel Prize for their work on H. pylori. In his Nobel lecture, Marshall quoted the historian of science, Daniel Boorstin. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge. Gastroenterologists were confident that they knew what caused and did not cause peptic ulcers. Marshall was a lowly resident planning to become a rheumatologist, and he had not bought into the gastroenterology consensus viewpoint. I'm told by others I have a lateral thinking, broad approach to problems, sometimes to my detriment, Marshall remarks. Lateral thinking was coined by Edward de Bono, a Maltese physician. The intent is to break up established habits of thought, recognizing that conventional thinking can impede creativity. I was thinking out of the box. Australia is out of the box if you're an American, and Western Australia is out of the Australian box. Everything about the Marshall story is diametrically opposed to EBM ideology. So leaving the backwoods of Australia, moving to the heartlands of Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. At this time, there was a dramatic surge in laboratory science, providing a new scientific base for clinical practice. In Germany, the term inner medicine was introduced to distinguish a new cadre of physicians who based their practice on an understanding of underlying causes and mechanisms of disease, as opposed to clinical medicine, which focused on symptoms, practitioner arts. These internists recognized that diseases have their origin in internal or hidden organs. It was at this time that doctors started to wear white coats. White coats partly originated in operating rooms to avoid cross-contamination, but this does not explain their use by non-surgeons. The main reasons doctors adopted white coats is because of their association with the laboratory, and clinicians wished to present themselves as scientists. As physicians' association with science became more ascendant, the art of medicine was seen to represent irrational remnants that would eventually be eliminated by means of additional research. Billroth, the Viennese surgeon, wrote about the need to establish the art of medicine for all time so firmly as to transform it wholly into a science. Despite colossal advances since the time of Billroth, it is now clearer than ever that large portions of clinical practice cannot be reduced to the application of universal rules. A doctor who advocates the use of protocols in the management of patients who have complex medical problems, such as ventilator weaning, is either nonchalantly exposing patients to harm or ignorant of the likelihood of harm that fragile patients are exposed to. Consider mechanical ventilation in patients with ARDS, where a tidal volume of 6 ml has been shown to lower mortality. This setting is so widely accepted that it has become de rigueur in protocolized management. Protocol advocates, ungrounded in physiology, do not recognize that low tidal volume is necessarily accompanied by shortening of mechanical inspiratory time. And once mechanical inspiratory time becomes less than neural inspiratory time, double triggering is inevitable. So the protocol enthusiasts believe they're delivering a tidal volume of 6 ml per kilogram, but the patient is actually receiving 12 ml per kilogram, a setting proven to increase mortality. There is no substitute for deep understanding and clinical wisdom when taking care of patients. The hallmark of an expert is sound intuitive judgment. Intuition shares many features with tacit knowledge, which is contrasted with explicit conscious knowledge. Tacit knowledge involves inarticulate knowledge based in actions, involving the fluid performance of a bodily skill, rather than conscious deliberations. Conscious thinking about the sequence of actions interferes with the execution and is detrimental to performance. Many skills in clinical medicine depend not simply on manual dexterity, but are cognitive and interpretive, the characteristics of a connoisseur of the highest rank. These skills can be communicated only by example, not by precept. You cannot learn these skills out of books or in a lecture hall. Much of the art of knowing which a student or resident needs to learn cannot be formulated as written precepts. Instead, these skills are learned during years of apprenticeship under the guidance of a master. Talk of intuition has obvious appeal to the lazy who think that true expertise is nothing more than a random guess or the inspiration of a Zen Buddhist or a Jungian mystic. Guessing involves reaching a conclusion when one does not have sufficient knowledge or experience to do so. In contrast, true intuitive skill is the final fruit of many years of experience and the use of deliberative analytic thinking as a trainee. Even though it looks automatic and we call it intuition, it is knowledge hard-earned and shaped by years of experience. In this editorial, I point out that the intersection between science and clinical practice involves the distinction between generalizability and singularity. The bedrock of science is generalizability. That is the move from the particulars of data set to make inferences about future patients. Clinical practice moves in the opposite direction, from the universal to the particular. The clinician needs to take broad principles gained through research and then customize them to the peculiarities of an individual patient. So focusing on a single patient as opposed to gazing upon a large number of patients produces a radical change in perspective. One single Anne Frank observed Primo Levi moves us more than the countless others who suffered just as she did, but whose faces have remained in the shadows. Each patient considers his or her complaint as one of great peculiarity or even obscurity and craves for personal attention. The patient is hoping for empathy. This painting is a self-portrait by Goya when he thought he was on his deathbed, attended by his physician. Goya is propped up in bed, struggling in acute pain. Dr. Arrieta's entire physiognomy is animated by the most benevolent expression. The inner character of Dr. Arrieta, captured by Goya, highlights the point I am making. At any one time, a physician must focus solely on the needs of an individual patient. Patients desire empathy, but they place a higher mass on expert knowledge and clinical judgment. Compassion never compensates for cognitive and technical incompetence. In contrast with the clinician's focus on a solitary patient, the scientist can improve the lives of millions. Figuring out how better to wean a patient helps patients not only in Chicago, but also in Cork, Cairo, Calcutta, and Christchurch. One topic on which science and art dovetail is understanding. Science produces facts, but science is no more an inventory of facts than history is a chronology of dates. Instead, science strives to make generalizable statements based on a deep understanding of the workings of nature. Facts and knowledge are greatly valued, but understanding is treasured more. I try to understand where the last words uttered by Jacques Monod, one of the founders of molecular biology. To make sense of information, to understand it, requires expert judgment. Finding patterns, like Cheyne-Stokes, drawing inferences from the data, and then seeing a whole that is larger than the individual parts. Physicians at the bedside also hanker after understanding. When faced with a difficult case, what a physician wants more than anything else is to figure out, to try and understand what is happening inside a patient's body. Tannenbaum undertook an ethnographic study of how physicians reason and think. The vast majority of physicians spend most of their time thinking and communicating with one another in terms of mechanisms of disease. Precisely what the founders of inner medicine recognized. Physicians spend much less time using outcomes type information such as RCTs. Even average cases can be challenging to a trainee, whereas experienced clinicians take them easily in their stride. But a small proportion of patients, fewer than 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, present major diagnostic challenges to even very experienced clinicians. These are the cases that disturb the sleep of a conscientious physician. The solution of these conundrums never rests in the capacity to recite some algorithm or apply some protocol, but depend on a clinician's power of imagination. Solving these mysteries depends on a clinician's capacity to imagine internal mechanistic happenings that can explain external clinical manifestations. Just as with transformative science, resolution requires the mind of a poet as opposed to the writer of prose. Speakers commonly talk of science and art in terms of a binary framework, as if one is antagonistic to the other, part of a zero-sum game. But both are required in the practice of medicine. The necessary body of knowledge contains both science and art or practical craft. The doctor is not functioning as a scientist, but rather as a skilled technologist, applying the principles of science in the care of the individual patient. Medical knowledge contains science, but a medical doctor does not operate as a scientist. Scientific principles gained through research are collective in outlook, generalizable universal statements, whereas the clinician's gaze is concentrated on the solitary patient. So in conclusion, the capacity to switch between two systems, science and art, demands equal proficiency in the use of the telescope and microscope. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. It was, I heard perhaps some version of this talk many years ago at the Toronto meeting, and the density and complexity of the information you've woven together, you know, I would be bound to get something new out of this talk, I feel, if I rewatched it a couple dozen times. So I really appreciated, yeah, you delivered exactly, I think, what we were hoping to in terms of challenging some conventional thoughts and leading our audience towards, I think, some questions that they may like to pose to you now about the talk or about perhaps some of the broader writings recently about the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll open it up to the floor, as it were. And if you're able to, Dr. Tobin, you can stop sharing your screen so we have a better opportunity to see the face.
So I hit stop share?
Yeah, that should be good. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Yep.
So Dr. Hedera, maybe I could put you on the spot. I feel like you might have many observations or questions, because I feel like these topics of history of medicine and art and science overlap strongly with the principles that you abide by.
Thank you, Dr. Hartfield. Thank you, Dr. Tobin. I would second Rob's comment that this was an incredibly packed talk and much to reflect on. There's a number of things I could ask you to comment on further. I do want to thank you for the inclusion of the alliterative C's. I was born in Cairo, so that's okay. Fortuitous of you to include that. I guess the one piece I'm going to ask you to comment on further is just something a little bit more practical, which is, you know, given that the pattern that you've identified, say with Barry Mitchell, with the H. pylori story, is depressingly persistent in science and in medicine. Peter Mitchell in the Oxford Wars, you know, he was forced to leave his post at Edinburgh and discovered the electron transport chain really just on the strength of his family's fortune. All the way back to the anatomists who challenged Galen and the theory of blood passing from the right to the left side of the heart through pores, despite everyone seeing that there are no pores. How, in practical terms, in a training program or in a critical care department in the modern era, or in national critical care societies, how do we challenge the system in ways that allows for those moments of brilliance that challenge dogma to have a chance at succeeding?
I think it would be to encourage insomnia. make sure that people get disturbed enough that they can't sleep comfortably. I mean, the way to challenge dogma is to make sure that you don't become a sheep. Have enormous skepticism of everything you hear. If you want, I mean, most of the time you don't have time for that. I mean, most of the time you have to go with the flow. But there should be a few questions you feel very passionate about. And the ones you feel passionate about, make sure you disregard what you're being told.
People are very attached to their sleep.
Yes. But if you are disturbed, you won't sleep easily. You know, I mean, I'm being facetious in terms of the sleep, but the main thing is that you shouldn't rest easily. I mean, you just if you want to upset the apple cart, you're going to have to think differently.
If I could, Dr. Tobin, this year you've published a dizzying number of editorials sort of challenging some of the COVID-19 early experts, so to speak, crying out for standardized care in a disease we knew very little about. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about your own personal, I guess, insomnia around that? I think we could all learn something from your own take on that sort of collision of values.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this briefly before I came on, and it's always the danger of discussing stuff ahead of time, because people who produce good radio programs that tell you that they have no discussion ahead of time because it will dampen out. But anyway, obviously, the very first paper I wrote on COVID was that I had been listening or participating, not listening, I'd been participating in an email string that had about 160 intensive care people on it. And these would be regarded as kind of the world leaders on intensive care, primarily with a focus on mechanical ventilation. And the stuff that I was seeing on that email string frightened the hell out of me. And so, and I literally couldn't sleep at night because of it. And, you know, that first paper that I wrote in the space of a few hours, because I just said I need to get down the key things in terms of how you approach these people physiologically. And the key message is to make sure that you do not intubate every patient that you're seeing. And I was aware that, you know, there was guidelines coming out everywhere telling you that you needed to do an enormous amount of intubating in these patients. And the first patient in our hospital that had been intubated, I mean, when I looked at the results the following morning, the patient was intubated. I wasn't in the ICU at the time. To me, it just didn't look like that this man merited intubation. And so I figured out that the problem was going to be a default approach towards easy intubation, because it's enormously easier to intubate somebody than to manage a patient without a tube. I mean, you make enormous number of enemies when you have somebody who you are trying to keep out the endotracheal tube, because all the nurses want the patient intubated. And especially then they'll say, but you're going to kill us all. We're all going to die if you leave this man without a tube, you know? And so you're certainly going to create enemies. And so, I mean, that was a major battle at the beginning. And you know, obviously I had written the paper, and then I said, but there's one key sentence missing in the paper. And then it was the last sentence I put in. I said, the surest way to increase mortality in COVID-19 is a liberal approach to intubation. And that unfortunately was borne out, because, I mean, we've had several studies since then, I mean, that have been published showing that as the rate of intubation went down over the first few months, the mortality went down. Because, I mean, the mortality in these patients once they're intubated is very high.
I think, is it Dr. Bosma next, then Dr. Slesarov? And then Dr. Leeper.
Hi, Dr. Tobin. Thank you so much for that talk. I agree with the other sentiments that is inspiring every time I listen to you speak. In London here, at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, initially we didn't deal so much with the push for early intubation as the push to not use non-invasive ventilation and not use high flow nasal oxygen because of the worry of aerosol generation and transmission of disease. And that led to some tragic results at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we quickly got together and said, okay, we can't suddenly stop using non-invasive ventilation in cases where it's been proven effective, and we can't stop using high flow nasal oxygen. So we need some, policy around that. How do we do this safely and to the best of our ability? And so we formed a ventilation working group just to put some guidelines in place to give everybody a kind of a stable footing. And we looked at both how to best support patients non-invasively, and then how to support patients invasively, just to put some groundwork and framework in place. And I think that was quite successful. We avoided intubating many patients, and those we tried to manage as safely as possible. But then we got stuck, and I realized that whenever I do a week of call in the ICU, the residents, we're a teaching hospital, and the residents will say, but Dr. Bosma, you didn't follow your protocol, you're not following your guideline. And why did you, decide to stop proning this patient and not this patient? And why are you starting to wean this patient, but this other patient you're saying we should paralyze? And like, nothing that I was doing seems to make sense to the learners. And that's because I've been at the bedside and adjusting ventilator settings and trying to figure out what works for that patient. And so I'm kind of stuck and wanted your opinion on how do you teach learners and residents how to do an individualized approach when every patient is their own patient and they're complex. And so how do you bridge that need for kind of general principles, but a tailored approach? How do you explain that to learners? Because they just sort of see me as being like not intelligible or understandable when they see I have 30 different approaches to 30 different patients.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a great question, but I mean, obviously, if you have 30 patients, I do believe you should have 30 different approaches. I believe every patient is totally different. I mean, there'll be a certain amount of things that are similar amongst them, but I mean, when I was a medical student, my designation was that I was an apprentice, just like you're an apprentice carpenter. Okay, and apprentice I think is a very good word. And it is that the key part of medical education is that you follow around a master or a mistress or whatever. You follow around a senior clinician. And what I tell residents is, don't pay too much attention to what I tell you. Just watch what I do. And it is figure out what I'm doing. And I mean, and obviously, I tell them, even in terms of when I'm rounding, when I ask them questions or something, then they'll tell me what I told them yesterday. I say, yeah, but that was Tuesday. Today is Wednesday. Wait, what were the correct answers for Tuesday aren't going to be the correct answers on Wednesday. So I mean, it is. I think obviously what you described is a beautiful example, because you tell me you wrote all the stuff with the protocols and the guidelines or whatever else, and then you went into the real world and you saw the patients, and then you said, but this is the reason I'm standing at the bedside, that I'm now seeing stuff that is not found on the protocols, and I'm making decisions based on what I'm seeing, and the residents spotted that. So, I mean, to me, this is all good. I don't see, I think it's perfect.
Dr. Slusser, I believe is next.
The other part was that at your beginning, in terms of the non-invasive, which was a different question, where you mentioned about how not using the non-invasive. I'm sure I don't know whether you realize or not, but I mean, the whole avoidance of non-invasive and all these things that all came from the WHO guidelines. I mean, which were extraordinarily influential. And I didn't realize it till I kind of went looking for it. I mean, that basis is based on 7 patients in Saudi Arabia that did badly with non-invasive. This is what the WHO guidelines are based on. Okay? It is extraordinarily hard to understand how the whole world is going to approach mechanical ventilation in patients with COVID based on 7 people that did badly in Saudi Arabia with MERS. If you go to the WHO guidelines, you will see that the word MERS is repeated 9 times. It's one of the most common words in the whole guidelines. You will find no mention of a physiological principle. That does not occur in all the guidelines. And they're basically telling you, don't use non-invasive. They're telling you, stick in endotracheal tubes rapidly. They're strongly encouraging you in doing that. And then the subsequent papers where people are telling you about their experience, to say we were heavily influenced by the WHO guidelines. That's why we did this. So your question gives me 2 different elements, because you're telling me, first of all, that you were avoiding non-invasive ventilation because you were told not to do it. And then you're telling me that when you developed your own kind of cheat sheet or whatever else, or what you wanted to do for organizing your own ICU, then the residents came and the students said, hey, but you're not following that. So, I mean, you've given me a beautiful vignette.
Yeah, I should clarify that it was at the very beginning of the pandemic, before we had a lot of COVID cases. The initial instructions were to avoid use of non-invasive ventilation. And very early on, we had an unfortunate incident where a patient came in with COPD, but didn't want intubation and wasn't offered an IV and died, unfortunately. So that we very quickly went to, no, we will use non-invasive ventilation.
Yeah, okay.
Murat?
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Tobin. I'll preface my my part of the conversation with saying that I am a physiologist before I became a physician. I do have a master's in respiratory physiology, and I read your books even before I was in medical school, and have done some research in the control of breathing and chemoreflexes before getting into med school, and then now I'm a clinician scientist here, sort of at the early part of my career. And I do straddle the space between, bench and the bedside, between what is commonly referred to as translational research. And it is challenging. It is challenging from the career perspective, because the current format of promotion at universities encourages primarily large grants, large trials, that kind of stuff. And how do you balance that? So I had a comment, and then I had a question for you. So the comment was, when I was very interested when you showed a slide on lateral thinking, and how the idea of lateral thinking is important. And I just wonder if it's really a practical form of cynicism that the Greeks have advocated for in the olden days, that you should be questioning established dogma, even the established dogma that are your own. So that's the common part. The question I had for you, I think when we think about protocols in general, especially during the current pandemic, we were all watching from the sidelines here in London as first Italy and then New York were overwhelmed with a number of patients, and we're preparing essentially to provide mechanical ventilations for hundreds or acute hypoxic respiratory failure management to hundreds and thousands of patients. And I think the protocol development was in part driven by the fact that we were now going to be asking our colleagues in internal medicine and emergency medicine, who may not have experience in mechanical ventilation to manage these patients with acute COVID illness. But I do agree with you. So on the one side, you have protocolized medicine, which has all of the downsides that you mentioned already, and you wrote about in your editorial so astutely. On the other hand, you have individual physicians doing whatever they want to do. And if you have everybody doing whatever they want to do in a group practice like ours, you will end up with having a lot of heterogeneity. And that sometimes can create confusion and potentially lead to adverse outcomes. So I guess my question relates to, how do you balance some sort of systematic approach to problem solving in clinical medicine, and yet retain that cynicism and that ability to tweak treatments for your individual patients?
Okay. Obviously, your question is very astute, very important. I disagree with you on the word cynicism. I think you mean skepticism. They're different. Okay. I am a card-carrying skeptic. I would hope I'm not a cynic. Okay, they're different. I'm with all respect to Diogenes, who was the original cynic, but I don't live in a barrel. So, but that's fine. Yeah, but the problem is, obviously, when I say you need individualized care and you need individual judgment, I am not advocating a laissez-faire approach. I'm not advocating anything goes, but it's a problem. And obviously, COVID is unique because it's the biggest event in my 46 years in practice. It's colossal. And one of the one of the interesting things is that in Chicago, there's 6 medical schools. And when COVID was happening in the spring, every single day, there was an Excel sheet that was coming out of the number of cases that were being admitted to the ICUs, the number of patients that are on ventilators. And it was amazing to see. There is some of the medical schools that would be the most highly regarded in the world had intubation rates of over 80%. It was just colossal. And then other ones, our particular intubation rate in my ICU was under 30% at the height of it. So you had all of these going all around the place. And so it was very variable. So it was very clear that in many of these patients were being intubated that didn't need to be intubated. There is a paper that came out of Mass General, out of one of the ARDS network group, and they had a very high rate of intubation. And then there was a letter to the editor that came in that was published in the Blue Journal from a man from Moscow. And his main question was, why are all these people being intubated? And then he went through the physiology of them and said, these people have these PO2s, they have this level of plateau pressures and whatever else. What are they doing on the ventilator? So there was no, and the main message in the paper out of Mass General was that what is really needed in the time of COVID, and the person who wrote it was also interviewed in the New York Times, saying what was really needed is that we needed to not reinvent the wheel, that we needed to stick with EBM, and we needed to apply EBM protocols in the management of these patients. Well, that's what you get. So you can tell me that, it's very disturbing to see that you have everybody doing a free fall in terms of how they're managing. Well, yes, but if you're telling me that every person who meets the lowest criterion gets ended up on the ventilator, it is very difficult to navigate your way through these rapids.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Leeper, it's your turn.
I will try to limit my pre-question ramble to under 15 minutes, Paul. Dr. Tobin, thanks so much. The talk was incredible, and I think sitting down and reading through your editorials beforehand was equally amazing. I want to just read back one quick sentence that I really enjoyed, and it captured in words a feeling I'd had for many years in my practice that I thought was really cool. You said, expressing vague and ill-defined concepts in mathematical terms gives them a specious air of respectability that cloaks lack of knowledge and perpetuates confusion. And I couldn't agree with that more. And so my question for you is, do you have practical advice for a lowly clinician like me of how to do battle with those who cloak themselves in that shield and who deny patients certain care or refuse to?
This is very old. Hans Christian Andersen.
Consider alternate options based on something they can't get their head around.
I think
I was just asking if you had any advice for dealing with that.
Yeah, I would read Hans Christian Andersen.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Hans Christian, who wrote the fairy tales. And so it's The Emperor Has No Clothes. And so you have to stand up and say, but the emperor's marvelous robes actually are naked. The emperor is stark naked. So that, I mean, because this is the problem when with all these, when you see all this stuff where it's written in that manner. Obviously, my sentence was directed against my good friend Luciano Gattinoni. Okay,
it was.
Because he's well capable of taking care of himself. I have no problem in mentioning him by name because he doesn't need my help to defend himself. But to me, he was making statements about in all kinds of numbers in the previous thing about this was all on PCILI, on patient self-inflicted lung injury. And on Monday morning, I was doing the Zoom conference again with Gattinoni. So this is long. It's a long going on battle, and they're still wanting to intubate everybody they see because the patients might have PCILI. So however I might have communicated with you, I certainly didn't persuade Luciano that there's major problems with PCILI. He is not buying any of my arguments. But that doesn't surprise me. I would imagine he has a hermetically sealed brain about these issues. So my only advice to you is that you have to puncture people. You have to puncture the balloon when you see it. But I'm an enormous fan of math. I've spent an enormous amount of my time doing math. I love math. But math is great, but it is, you have to realize when people are cloaking their stuff in math, that really is all most likely circular reasoning. They're probably just going around chasing their tail and there's really no argument. If you try and unpack it, there's probably no content in there. And so, when you see it, you just have to call it out.
Wonderful.
And know that you will just add to your list of enemies.
Is that the same for the p-values, Dr. Tobin?
Yep. P-values, obviously, I would have to be a hypocrite because I've used an enormous number of p-values in my time. But you have to realize there's something fairly idiotic when you say that if it is p.049, it's magical, and if it's p.051, it's dreadful. Right. There's something awfully, it's like tachycardia, that if you have a heart rate of 99, you're okay. And if you have a heart rate of 101, you're on, need to be seeing a cardiologist. It's idiotic to have these fine times. And especially when you're talking about numbers, because it's when you use words instead of numbers. Again, it's like a p-value is beautiful, but it doesn't need to have the word significant attached to it. The word tachycardia is superfluous in medicine. You just tell me what the heart rate is. I can understand. if the heart rate is 98, I understand exactly what it is. If the heart rate is 105, I understand what exactly it is. But I don't want words. The words are only confusing me.
It's an ironic statement, given what a linguophile you are, Dr. Tobin, to say words are confusing because you use them so well. Dr. Honorman, I believe you're next.
Thank you. Dr. Tobin, thank you so much for the talk. Really, really enjoyed it. A lot of us, I think, have had the opportunity to see some of your talks at our Canadian Critical Care Forum over a number of years as well. And I'm really happy that I get a chance to ask you my question that I've been wondering about since I first heard you talk about, and this is about your comments about guidelines and your skepticism about guidelines. And I think the sentiments that you express are shared by many of us, especially as you put it today, the comment about, it's kind of I don't remember your exact language, but it was something about, a lazier approach, protocolizing everything as opposed to kind of looking at the individual patient as following a template rather than looking at what that particular patient needs. I guess my question for you is about what the alternative is. And Dr. Slessor got a little bit into this question, but I kind of had a different sort of perspective on this. For example, Dr. Bosma mentioned she developed a protocol and then her residents pointed out that she's not following her own protocol. I would argue that she's allowed not to follow her own protocol, even though she wrote it and she wants others to follow it because she's an expert. Like, she's the intensivist managing the ventilator of this patient. I don't know if guidelines in the formal sense should be intended towards world-renowned or any kind of expert specialist in that particular topic. We know certain things about, in every other field, any field where there's guidelines, we know that the experts come in and say, look, I know that's what they say, but we're going to do something different here. Because that is what a specialist is supposed to be good at, is they're supposed to be individualizing and the therapy to the patient in the context of guidelines, but you might have to deviate. So I actually think Dr. Bosma, not following her own guidelines is providing individualized patient care is totally appropriate, even though it deviates. But our guidelines were more intended towards, trainees overnight. And what?
Great question. I think you're asking a great question. I mean, and obviously, for in this particular instance, I've interacted with Dr. Bosma at posters and I've heard her speak. And if she came and was at my bedside, I would much prefer that she was taking care of me with her head rather than applying some protocol. But again, it's back to your question in terms of whether experts are allowed to break their own protocols. Well, then that tells you that the protocols are bad. So, I mean, you are really kind of you're sawing off the branch on which you're sitting on your own tree, because, I mean, I think the way you phrased it is a perfect example of the limitation of protocols. If you want protocols so as that you can help the worst people in your hospital to deliver the least worst type of care, yeah, well, then protocols probably are good for that. But that shouldn't be really where we're aiming for. I mean, obviously, then there's protocols and protocols. If you're telling me you have a protocol for how you set up a dialysis machine, and if you go through all the checklists and something like that, yeah, then I can see that is fine for something like that. I mean, because that's almost on thinking type of stuff. But most of practical medicine is not like that. I mean, the idea that that you would have protocols that would tell you how to wean somebody, to me, is totally insane. I just can't understand that. I mean, and I recall it probably in the mid 80s. At that stage, I was of the belief that probably everything could be developed into a protocol. I thought, that at that stage, that if you could develop algorithms, I was fascinated by all these triangles or all these different circles and arrows going this way. And I was developing them for everything to do in my practice for the residents. I mean, and I did it probably for about 2 years. And then I realized that I was harming them, that this was just going, you just have to stand at the bedside and figure it out.
Dr. Basmaji. John Basmaji. Okay. Dr. Chintan.
Thanks, Dr. Armfield. Thank you, Dr. Tobin, for the amazing and inspirational lecture. I'm one of the ICU trainees. So from a trainee perspective, I had a question. Over the last, few months dealing with this, I've sometimes found myself pretty preoccupied with the human struggle of my patients. And then I tend to sometimes ignore the advanced pathophysiological state of their disease. Other times, sometimes I find that I'm prioritizing kind of, guideline-based approach to patients who are standard, i.e. like typical sepsis, typical ARDS. And I find I kind of standardize just my approach and care to them and not, don't approach them as individualistically as I should. So my question is, as a trainee, is there any practical way how I could be aware of myself when I'm leaning too heavily on one aspect of medicine, whether I'm leaning too heavily on the scientific, systematic, generalizability of medicine that includes a lot of these protocols that we talk about, or if I'm leaning too heavily on the human and individualistic aspect, which, of course, compassion, as you mentioned, without the right knowledge and skill set is not a good standard of care either. So is there a way of how to be self-aware about that as I progress through training and thereafter?
I hear you. I hear your question. And I think you've answered it.
I didn't hear.
Because it is clear to me by the way you're asking the question that you are self-reflective. And I think that's the key thing. That you have to be constantly, almost like Narcissus looking in the stream. You have to be constantly looking at the mirror and seeing what exactly are you doing. Mm-hmm. And the approach from one patient should be heavily based, probably just on the compassionate aspect. That probably the physiology stuff doesn't matter in some patients. And then in the next patient, it will be different. The next patient, you're going to have a major struggle in trying to really figure out what are the pathophysiological mechanisms going on in this patient. So they will be very different from one patient to the next. But I think what is very important is that in every patient that you have, literally all of them, it's almost like you write a diary at the end of the day. Some people write diaries. I kept diaries early in my life, but I no longer keep diaries in the evening. But I mean that you reflect on what happened during the day. And in patients, whenever we have a patient that sailed on a weaning trial, for example, I will generally say to the residents, well, that's very bad. Because that means he should have been weaned hours beforehand. If he flew so easily, we clearly screwed up, okay? Because that's not the way it should be. So it clearly means that we went way too slow. And in every patient, it's crucial that, because nobody is going to be as critical as yourself. You will be much more critical about yourself than your teacher will. They'll all be afraid that you'll give them bad grades if they criticize you. Okay.
Fair enough.
So you need to be your own critic.
Great, thank you so much.
And I think it sounds like you're doing that already.
Thank you.
Dr. Basmaji, are you with us again now?
I am. Thank you. So Dr. Tobin, one of the things that you said that really resonated with me was that innovation happens in big leaps and it's often serendipitous and not something that we prepare for. But academic institutions and infrastructures these days are really biased towards incremental research. And this kind of manifests in how you get funded.
Yep. Are you?
Or trying to kind of make a career for themselves, how to diverge out of the pack. And I'm looking, what kind of advice do you have for budding scientists who want to be innovators, but also want to not lose the mentorship of those who are more traditionally incremental researchers? And what are your thoughts on how to navigate the process?
I suppose the economists or whatever, or your stockbroker will tell you to have a diverse portfolio, right? So I would imagine that you would have to, you have to keep the crowds happy. You have to keep your chairman happy, because so you can do all this, the boring stuff that'll get you funded. Okay, they'll pay the bills and the mortgage. But there should be, you need to have at least 10%, if not 20% of stuff that is totally harebrained stuff that you need to do. And that's the fun stuff. But I mean, it's a bit of a trouble if you're going to spend 100% of your time doing the harebrained stuff. You'll get into trouble. But I think, I mean, you need to do mundane stuff. And I mean, if I look back, most of the papers I had the least trouble with were really mundane. They were extraordinarily boring papers. Don't ask me, but I mean, they get done and you do something or whatever else, and you know, but generally the reviewers give no trouble with those. It's the papers that were that I got the most trouble over were the ones that really mattered. You know, that's just the way it is. But I mean, so I think it is that you need, if you're at a younger stage, that you need to make sure that you dedicate particular time for screwy ideas, because the really good stuff generally will have come out of something that's kind of, that goes against the grain. I mean, if it's not going against the grain, well, then the chances of it being in any way going to change things isn't going to happen.
That's
I mean, I mean, I'm obviously an Irishman, and so I take my advice from my fellow countryman Oscar Wilde, who said, "I hate when people agree with me, because then I believe I must be wrong."
Tina.
Okay. So just along those lines, thank you again, Dr. Tobin, for just a stimulating talk, and for all of your contributions. But along the same lines, I'm sure you had the same experience, that the screwiest or the most unexpected result that you got in the lab is the one that you had the hardest time to publish and get accepted somewhere, and then it usually takes about 5 to 10 years where it starts getting cited and picked up. Was that your experience?
Yep.
Yeah, like the most unexpected observation in my lab was just like a sideline, and then couldn't get it anywhere, and now it's like my highest cited publication, which is so frustrating, because I know I submitted it to so many articles, so many journals, and it's always like that one that takes forever to get accepted somewhere.
George Orwell's Animal Farm was rejected by 14 publishers. So it's not confined to medicine. Okay. So, I mean, it is obviously the vast majority of totally screwy, useless things are also rejected. So it's not exact. So if having stuff over rejected doesn't mean that they're really good. It's, you know, it's all, they're all different. Each one is different. But I mean, you know, it is, but the reality is, that it's far easier to publish boring stuff.
So what advice do you have? Because by the time you've submitted it 3-4 times, you just can't bother, like you just cannot stomach this paper again to try to resubmit it somewhere. But it's like an interesting so do you have advice for that? Because I mean, I have so many papers that I just, you know, just can't stomach to do the work on again.
3 or 4 seems a very low number to me. In terms of, I have papers that have been rejected far more than 3 or 4 times.
I guess you just work your way down from impact factor until you finally get it. Okay.
Yeah.
That's I think it's deeply reassuring, Dr. Tobin, to hear about you know, that the titans of our field have had similar shared experiences, and it's quite normalizing and encouraging for many of us. We have a few.
I'll give you a particular example because obviously you are aware that I wrote on ARDS. And you told me that it sounded like a Santa Claus moment.
Yes, that's where I was going.
So
yes.
that paper, I can tell you, was rejected from 2 journals from people that I would think were my friends. And they told me that the problem with rejecting it was that I was saying nothing new and that was also far too radical. And they didn't see any irony in pointing that out. And you, I mean, so this is.
So perhaps we could, in our closing moments, we could circle around that topic of ARDS, which you're. I think it's article number 7 on the reading list that was sent out. I feel like it's like a BuzzFeed plant. Number 7 will shock you. You describe, does diagnosing ARDS in the context of COVID make a difference? And I guess I would want to maybe leave a bombshell question. Does diagnosing ARDS at all make a difference, given a lot of the concerns you cite in that paper? And are we overly obsessed with this disease entity? Because a lot of the criticism you raise there, I would argue, are just as valid outside of the context of COVID.
Yeah, I believe it doesn't make a difference. I believe you need to do research on ARDS. So ARDS is very useful for doing research. You need to put people into nosological categories in terms of you homogenize when you're doing a randomized controlled trial. So it's useful for something like that. But to me, at least 10 years, I believe that it was totally useless for me as a clinician at the bedside. There was nothing. There was no decision that's based on it. That comes out of it. So it's just, I mean, and this is not COVID. I mean, it was just that with COVID, I mean, what was amazing to me that in the early days of COVID, the main thing was, is this typical or atypical ARDS? I mean, this was mind-boggling, because this was, I mean, who the hell cares whether it's typical or atypical? It's a totally irrelevant question. The only relevant question you have in any of these sick people is, do I stick in a tube or I don't stick in a tube? And that has nothing to do with ARDS.
So is ARDS real? Is it actually a thing? Because I've spoken with many, I would think, people in your category of leading researchers who are starting to challenge the validity of the very entity. I know pathologically it exists, but if it makes no difference clinically, is it something we should, again, if we're going to take the theme of this dialogue as controversial as we can, which is part of the spirit of things, should we rewrite the book on this in some way?
Well, you have to be careful. I mean, it's a metaphysical question. So it is very difficult to know if something exists. I mean, the perfect example is the Loch Ness Monster. So does the Loch Ness Monster exist? There's a lot of people who swear that it exists. There's an awful lot of other people. And when I was young, there was far more people believing it to exist. In Ireland, we were very fascinated by the Loch Ness Monster. It was on our doorstep, so this was a big question. But it is, in terms of many entities within science, it's very difficult to know if something actually exists or not. And I think ARDS is not a thing. I think it's a sociological construct. And insofar as that goes, it's kind of exists, but it is an entity of convenience. But because in the editorial, in the chest editorial, I give the example of natural kinds. And because this is really metaphysics. And it is because metaphysics is a layer below epistemology, and you're into ontology. So it is back to Bishop Berkeley and knowing if when you kick a stone that it really is there or it's in your imagination. These are deep. They're not trivial questions. And so I don't believe it's at any of those type of levels, but it's a rag bag that you can throw stuff into.
That's a great note to end on, Murat. We're just bumping up against time. Do you have a quick follow-up?
I do have a quick follow because I think in critical care in general, one of the challenges that we face with innovation and science is that we deal with syndromes, which is a collections of signs and symptoms that may not have nothing to do with being diseases which have underlying pathophysiological processes. And ARDS is a great illustration of this. In its own definition, you have pulmonary ARDS and non-pulmonary ARDS. Sepsis, the same thing. And until we can make the leap towards actually identifying disease processes and naming them as such and developing disease-specific therapies, I think I agree with Dr. Tobin that all of these are constructs that help us group patients, but may not necessarily help us manage them or find specific treatments that work.
I mean, I think the movement in medicine always is out of syndromes towards disease. So, I mean, if you have Cushing's syndrome, that's fine. I mean, this is the construct. And then you have Cushing's disease, which is looking particularly where you're able to label it is the pituitary is causing the problem. So you always want to be able to move towards disease. In critical care, I completely agree with you. A whole pile of the things are only going to be in syndromes for a very long time. And again, then much of your management is going to be based on physiological findings in those patients. And so your therapy isn't going to necessarily matter in terms of whether it's a disease or a syndrome or whatever else, because you are really trying to tweak things based on what are the characteristics that each individual patient has. Because most of the time we don't have any great therapies for an awful lot of the things. We don't have anything, you know, that is really specific for sepsis other than antibiotics and fluids. We're not really doing, we've been down the road for looking at anti-nuclear or whatever, all the interferon antibodies and all these type of things. I mean, there's billions that have been poured into that. It came up naught. So it is, but you're still back to trying to fix the patient based on what are the findings. And so it is, that will be in the realm of findings. And it's the same with ARDS. It's what you're trying to manipulate oxygen, ventilation, whatever else, but you're not doing it any differently whether the patient has ARDS or doesn't have ARDS.
That's a great note to end on. Dr. Tobin, what a fabulous 90 minutes for our program. I can't tell you just how illuminating and invigorating this has been for us. Yeah, I think we'll be unpacking this for a while. You've raised some terrific discussion points where I'm sure we have a healthy amount of internal disagreement or controversy. We all have some screwy ideas that we'll feel more confident in advancing forward, and we'll move closer towards 9 or 10 rejection letters before we start believing that our articles are less than worthwhile. So on behalf of our entire program, a really heartfelt thank you for spending your time with us today.
Thank you for all the discussion, because you asked great questions. So it was very, very, a lot of fun.
We'd love to have you back maybe another time in a year or so, if you're still willing.
Yep, I mean, but in reality, not virtual, because these things are, this is not my favorite medium.
Fair enough. We will get to work on that and speak about internally how to get you to our good city of London.
All right, grand.
Thanks so much, Dr. Tobin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.